Again. Our next speaker today is one of our own, Julie Nania, whom you met yesterday. So I won't do the big introduction. I will note, though, that she is not the dean. She had a moment of grandeur here. It reminds me of my horoscope I read yesterday, and I don't normally read horoscopes. On the way home, I stopped for a sandwich and I read my horoscope, and it said, "For the next 2 days, you will be unusually powerful." I said, yeah, that could work for me. All right. So I'm tempted to tell all sorts of embarrassing stories about Julie, but I'm just going to wait until a better time. So Julie, who's not the dean, who's a Getch's fellow, take it away.
So I do have to apologize. Apparently the formatting got messed up. I don't quite have a dean complex yet, but we'll see after today. So today I've got the fortune of talking to you about some of the research that I've been doing over the past year, which has involved traveling around the Colorado River Basin and talking to a lot of tribal officials, tribal water resource managers, and then also state officials that deal with managing tribal water resources. And the title of my talk is New Tribal Water Uses, and there's that dirty word marketing. Well, if it would help the audience, I can call it voluntary water transfers. We can call it a number of different things. Basically, I'm talking about marketing in terms of when you exchange the right or ability to use an amount of water for some sort of financial gain. So we're going to talk about this broadly, but it is voluntary, and there are some other interesting uses going on that I'm going to touch on. So before I get into these details, 2.9 million acre feet. This is a number we heard yesterday during Amy Cordalis' talk, and this is the amount of water that tribes have actually quantified in the Colorado River Basin. She threw out another number during that talk, which is 2 million acre feet. That is the potential unsettled, the magnitude of these unsettled rights. That is a huge quantity of water. So when we're sitting here having these discussions about the future of the river basin, I really think that this should be an integral component of that, because how tribes use their water matters. So to start off with, tribes are using water in a variety of different ways. Today we are lucky enough to have the presence of a few people from the Crit Reservation, Colorado River Indian tribes. They have got a vibrant farming and agricultural community down there, and have for some time. Many tribes in the basin are still engaging in agriculture, and some are even seeking to expand these uses. When we talk about new uses, Amy mentioned yesterday the lack of development on some reservation lands. So for some tribes, actually developing water infrastructure on the reservation could be considered a new use. And I think the Navajo-Gallup pipeline is a great example of this over on the eastern side of the Navajo reservation, which will run approximately 300 miles and actually serve that entire eastern portion of the nation, as well as the city of Gallup. Another use that could be considered new, this is a point that's arguable because tribes have been fishing in their traditional territories since time immemorial, but using water resources for environmental or non-consumptive purposes. One great example of this that I think we could take note of is the Zuni Heaven settlement that was recently concluded in 2003. In that settlement, the Zuni tribe has got a reservation land in New Mexico that was set aside for religious and cultural purposes. And they were actually able to come to an agreement with the state of Arizona, and it was quite clever the way they arrived at this conclusion, where they could irrigate traditional plants in wetlands. Irrigate traditional plants and wetlands to actually achieve the restoration of that wetland area for religious and cultural uses. But today, since we've got a limited amount of time, I'd really like to focus in on one of these new uses. And I am going to call it marketing instead of voluntary water transfers, just because it's concise. But when I do speak of marketing, I'm talking about deferral agreements. I actually think that those are an example that if you look at marketing broadly, you could consider marketing, because The tribe is deferring the use or development of its resources, usually in exchange for financial gain. I'm talking about forbearance agreements. Talking about traditional leasing, it's not necessarily a new use. Since reservations were established, non-Indian irrigators were leasing out reservation lands and using tribal water to farm on those lands. But I'm also going to talk about some of the newer developments, which include, in 2011, the Jicarilla Apache Nation held the first ever tribal water auction. They held an auction for water. Now, they followed this up with a second auction in 2012, last September. Another example of maybe a new development is the Mescalero Apache Nation's leasing bill that's now pending in Congress, where they're seeking to establish the authority to lease water to different municipalities in New Mexico. This is a conference where we're talking a lot about Arizona. Well, the 2006 Arizona v. California Consolidated Decree actually gave approval to a forbearance agreement between the Quechan Indian tribe and Metropolitan Water District. Under the terms of that forbearance agreement, the tribe has the option to voluntarily forego from using a portion of its water in any given year, and in exchange, Metropolitan Water District will compensate the tribe for the use of that water. These are just a handful of the new uses or different uses that tribes are engaging in right now, but they help to set the context for the rest of this discussion. So, despite this abundance of activities, many of these agreements that we're seeing happen in settlements. They also happen in agreements where tribes will go back to the courts for approval of a specific arrangement. And largely the reason that this is occurring is because neither the courts nor Congress have ever comprehensively defined the scope of Indian Federal Reserve rights. This is something that we touched on yesterday when Brett Birdsong gave a great introduction to Federal Reserve rights generally, and Amy started to talk about some of the problems that are arising or that they're seeking to address in these settlement agreements. However, despite the uncertainty of this, there has been some indication in precedent about how tribes can use their water. And today, I know we are sitting here and we've got a room full of people from different backgrounds, but I do want to go to that legal place, and I want to look at some of the precedent that Arizona has set up in the cases that have followed addressing this issue. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the future of these rights and how determination of these rights will impact or could potentially provide a solution for Colorado River Basin users. So to get into this discussion, we really have to return to Winters, where arguably it all started. Well, we could say that it started when tribes established their rights to these lands since time immemorial. However, in Winters, the Supreme Court first determined that when the federal government creates a federal reservation, it impliedly reserves the water necessary to fulfill the purpose of that reservation. We're going to come back to that language that talks about fulfilling the purpose of the reservation, because that's at the core of this discussion of how tribes can use this water. Without going into too many details, because Amy did a great job of that yesterday, I do want to point out that when Justice McKenna was writing the majority opinion for this decision, he was relying on principles of Indian law. And this becomes important when we start talking about some of the differences between Indian Federal Reserve rights and other Federal Reserve rights. When he was writing this opinion, he looked to Winans, and he looked to the court's determination that when there's an ambiguity or some uncertainty in the scope of Federal Reserve rights, you look to the treaty, and then you construe that treaty from the viewpoint of the Indians and how they themselves would have interpreted that. So applying this lens, he looked at the situation in Winters and found that the Indians had command of the lands and the waters, command of all of their beneficial use. Did they give up all this? Did they reduce the area of their occupation and give up the waters which made it valuable or adequate? Well, obviously this was rhetorical because he found the way he did. He found that they had not, that they had actually reserved these rights. So for 50 years, the doctrine, the Winters Doctrine, I'm using that synonymously with the Indian Federal Reserve Rights Doctrine, lay relatively dormant, at least in terms of defining the scope of these rights, until, of course, Arizona came along. Now, without going into too many of the details, once again, the tribe heard the claims of 5 mainstream tribes after weeding down those claims from, actually, I think it was initially 80, then the special master wrote an opinion and the government introduced the claims of 25, and then they finally got it down to just these 5 mainstem tribes. Well, the court affirmed the Winters Doctrine, and that was no small feat in itself. Then it went on to sanction the PIA standard, or the practically irrigable acreage standard, as the only feasible and fair way to quantify these rights. It also, similarly to Winters, looked at these rights and found that their foundation was in the statutes and treaties creating these reservations. So once again, we're not just looking at an executive order, we're looking at a treaty-based right generally, or a right based in an executive order, and we're looking at these rights from a perspective which uses the canons of construction. Despite all Arizona did to contribute to the case law surrounding that, it also left a lot of questions unanswered. Authority over Indian Federal Reserve rights is a huge, huge question. Another one of those questions is the exact scope of these rights. It gave us some indications, but it didn't sit down and describe explicitly how tribes can use or apply these rights. And then finally, the one I'd really like to focus on for the rest of this discussion is water marketing, or voluntary water transfers, a permissible use of Indian Federal Reserve rights? I'd like to look at this from 2 different angles. The first angle is to look at Winters' rights generally, and to look at their nature and determine, are these supposed to be interpreted broadly or narrowly, maybe to fulfill a specific purpose for a specific use. The other approach is to look at that language directly, talking about the purpose of the reservation, and to see, how does water marketing fit into this? Does it happen to fulfill that purpose? Taking this first approach, Federal Reserve rights are expansive. Once again, going right back to the Winters decision, the court there found that it would be extreme to believe that Congress took from them, he's talking about the Indian tribes, the means of continuing their old habits, yet did not leave them the power to change to new ones. He found it incredulous that they would confine tribes to reservations and restrict them to limited means of existence. If we go up to Arizona, we can also find indications of expansive use, particularly in Special Master Rifkin's report. In that report, Rifkin noted that once quantified, Indian Federal Reserve rights can be used for any purpose. The court adopted this conclusion. The court also adopted his finding that the water was intended to satisfy the future, as well as the present needs of the Indian reservations. And he elaborated how many Indians there will be and what their future needs will be can only be guessed. Now, this second piece of language does come from the language of addressing PIA and the standard of quantification. However, it demonstrates, when paired with that first part, that these rights are supposed to be expansive. They weren't looked at in a particular time period and weren't supposed to be restricted to the situation on the ground. So if I had an hour, I would love to talk for about 30 of those minutes about Walton and Anderson. I think they're 2 of the cases that have contributed the most to this area since then. However, I'm going to give you the brief and dirty version and just say that Walton and Anderson dealt with regulatory jurisdiction on the reservation of reservation waters, and I'm just going to look at this language that relates to purpose. So in Walton, the court adopted similar language to Arizona, finding that when the tribe has a vested property right in reserved water, it may use it in any lawful manner. In Anderson, a couple years later, they adopted similar language, saying that the tribe is, of course, entitled to utilize its water for any lawful purpose. Now, I'd like to note that the Walton court put its money where its mouth was. It had actually quantified the PIA, or the Colville's tribe's right based on the PIA standard, and later actually approved an in-stream flow use of that right. So these words, at least for that court, had real meaning. When we get to the state courts, precedent's a little bit more conflicting. Many of us in this room are very familiar with both of these adjudications. The Bighorn series up in Wyoming. The Wyoming Supreme Court restricted the Wind Rivers tribe to using water on reservation and exclusively for irrigation. And it actually told the tribe that if they wished to obtain an in-stream flow, they would have to do so through the state prior appropriation system. Well, about a decade later, in the Gila River adjudication, the Arizona Supreme Court came to a drastically different conclusion. And it found that the water was reserved basically to fulfill a wide range of homeland uses and purposes. So to kind of summarize this first approach, the Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit have adopted language that indicates that these rights are expansive. And the state court precedent is conflicting on the issue. So that brings us to kind of our second approach to looking at this issue. Isolating that language from Winters, in Winters, the court determined that the touchstone inquiry for how the scope of federal reserve rights should be construed is the purpose of the reservation. Well, what is the purpose of the reservation? This is not an obvious and easy question to answer. And then once that purpose is determined, how do you tell if a particular use will actually fulfill that purpose? Initially, we had this rhetoric that reservations were established for Indians to become farmers. Winters noted that reservations were created with the intent that Indians become farmers. This was a phrase that was commonly found in treaties of that time. Arizona accepted the PIA standard after recognizing that one of the purposes of the reservation was for agricultural development. And then once again, we've already talked about Bighorn a bit, but they found that the purpose of the reservation was specifically for the Indians to use that water for agricultural development. However, this is a very narrow construction of the purpose of the reservation, and it looks only to one part of the treaty language and interprets that treaty in a very narrow manner. I think Walton had some great commentary on this case when the court said that Congress envisioned agricultural pursuits as only a first step in the civilizing process, and that its vision of progress implies a flexibility of purpose. That's a nice summary with saying, okay, well, they did actually note that there was this agricultural purpose, but overall, the reservation's intent is more broad than this. So if we carry that forward, in the Gila River adjudication, the Arizona Supreme Court first recognized explicitly the homeland standard, noting that the reservation's purpose could be construed in a variety of different ways, but the overall intent behind establishing this was to make a place where the Indians could become self-sufficient, and on that basis, it recognized that this meant to serve as a permanent homeland for the tribes. I want to point out that this isn't just a standard that the court pulled from thin air. There's actually language in the treaties and in other cases identifying the reservation for a more broad use. And once again, going right back to Winters, where it all started, the Winters court recognized that the reservation was created as and for a permanent home and abiding place of the tribes. So to summarize this, the purpose of the reservation can be construed in different ways, whether you look at this intent narrowly, really latching on to that agricultural development standard, or more broadly to the general intent of Congress to create a permanent homeland for tribes. That brings us to the second part of that question, which is, what uses fulfill the purpose of the reservation? Does water marketing? And at this point, I thought it would be appropriate to give a nod to David Getches, because he really he hit the nail on the head when he said that the overall purpose of virtually all Indian reservations is to provide a permanent homeland where a tribe can be economically self-sufficient and govern itself. Consequently, it is reasonable to allow a tribe's water rights to be put to the highest economic use that the tribe may choose, whether on or off the reservation. Well, obviously, as we can tell from David's quote, he thought that permitting the tribe to develop economically fulfilled the purpose of the reservation as a permanent homeland. And I would put forth, too, that tribes are sovereigns, and part of being a sovereign and developing your sovereignty and developing an economic land base is using your natural resources to whatever means you need to achieve your ultimate goals. And under these circumstances, that can be using water for marketing to be able to develop the infrastructure that's lacking on the reservation, to be able to provide for crucial and instrumental government services. So at this point, I'd like to take a step back from the legal doctrine and look at what should we be looking at when we're talking about how tribes can use their water. Well, precedent is definitely one part of that equation. We just can't get away from it, as you all well know. I think the situation on the ground is incredibly informative, particularly in this context. When Arizona and those cases were decided, tribes were in a much different situation. Charles yesterday mentioned that we were in a termination era. Tribes really weren't major players at this table. We were also not dealing with the same realities of today. We've been seeing this graph a little today, maybe yesterday as well. We've been talking about these really scary things like shortages, like reduced releases from Lake Powell. Climate change was not really an issue. And then there's bears. Just kidding, there's not bears. He's just seeing if everyone's still awake. Sorry. Basically, we've got a lot of new scary things that we weren't anticipating at that time. Bears, there are probably more bears then than there are now. Basically, we've got this new reality, though, that really calls for flexibility in the system. We've been talking about potential options. Well, I'm not an economist, and I'm not usually the one that stands up in the room and spouts on about free markets, but it seems like tribal water marketing could potentially provide for some flexibility in the system. One other thing I'd really like to mention at this point is tribes are sovereigns. Tribes are not just another interest on the river. As sovereigns, they have an inherent right to self-determination, including to determine how they use those resources. We talked about those big numbers at the start of the presentation. Those big numbers aren't going to go away. Walden Court had some interesting commentary on this once again when it explained that permitting the Indians to determine how to use reserved water is consistent with the general purpose for the creation of an Indian reservation, providing a homeland for the survival and the growth of the Indians and their way of life. So what is the future of Indian Federal Reserve rights? What is the future of their uses? Well, at the start of this talk, we introduced a few examples of piecemeal legislation. I think in the short term, that will continue to provide a nice bridge to some of these uses because it allows some of these unanswered legal questions to be worked out in a safe space and to conclude some beneficial uses for both parties. However, ultimately, I would hope that there is some legislative clarification because as nice as those piecemeal legislation are, anyone who has watched any bill try to get through this process or has played any role in these knows that it takes an enormous amount of time and commitment to get those through, and that maybe a little bit of clarification on permitting tribes to determine their own uses would be helpful. And then I think most importantly, tribes acting in their sovereign capacity will be a huge driving factor in how tribes are using their water. We've seen recently that the 10 Tribes Partnership hosted the CRUA conference this year. That looks a lot different than in Arizona when the tribes weren't even virtually present largely, and I think you could agree to this, when they're sitting there determining the scope of these reserve rights. A specific example of the future of tribal water marketing, the 10 Tribes Partnership introduced just the skeleton outline of a water marketing or banking proposal during the Colorado River Basin study. In that proposal, it suggests that they would have an upper basin bank and a lower basin bank, and that tribes at their own discretion would be able to voluntarily participate in that. I think that's a good start for an option, and although it's going to take a lot of development, we just heard about some of the challenges of water banking. To get to the point, I think if the tribes continue to act in this driving force and continue to come up with these creative ideas and to really assert themselves, and if the Bureau of Reclamation starts making more space for them at the tables, which I think we're really seeing, that this very well could become a very real and effective solution to some of the shortage issues that we're seeing in the basin. As a final note, this is a really short time, and I really have been looking into this for years, so if anyone would like to talk about this or continue these discussions anymore, that's my contact information, and I'd be happy to continue a discussion. Thanks.
Julie's fear of bears stems from the fact that a bear has repeatedly broken into her home, into her garage, and it steals her whiskey, which scares her also.
Story.
I think we have a time for one or two quick questions. Oh, I gotta grab the microphone here and do my thing.
Yeah, Julie, I was wondering, it seems like it's obviously a problem as far as quantification is concerned, but do you think that the issue of the marketing aspect is going to be a problem once the rights are quantified and a tribe is looking to then utilize those rights in the future?
I guess I'm a little unclear on the question, but I think that obviously quantification is the first step, because really knowing what you have before you agree to lease it to anyone is obviously an important step in the process. But I do think that there are some potential barriers to marketing efforts. I think that is one of the reasons. I mean, when we talk about these unsettled legal questions, you know, one of the issues that can come up is you could contest tribal water marketing based on the purpose of the Federal Reserve right, like we were just talking about. So although I think that argument would come out in favor of tribal water marketing, you know, there are these issues. So I think in the meantime, while they remain unclarified, that really, that's why we're going to see a lot of that piecemeal legislation when we kind of iron out any of these potential hurdles.
Yeah.
Just a quick question on the Navajo. They're in a unique situation. The Navajo Nation has upper basin interest in Utah, upper basin interest in New Mexico, upper basin interest in Arizona, lower basin interest in Arizona, lower basin interest in New Mexico. So there's, you know, they're like a five-sided jigsaw puzzle there. As a sovereign, what flexibility do you think they have to use water that they may obtain from Utah, from the San Juan River, which borders the tribe, say in Arizona for either upper basin or lower basin in Arizona for tribal purposes?
I think that is an incredibly complex question, and if I said anything either way, everybody in this room would have a different opinion on it. That's my immediate gut reaction. The other thing is, let's just say, I think that's one nice thing about settlements, and that's going back to Amy's talk about yesterday, is especially if a tribe goes in knowing what it wants to use those waters for, there is a way to agree to specific boundaries of use, either on reservation, off reservation, potentially across state lines, potentially. So I think that would be one of those questions that you probably want to really deal with before you get that water.
Good question. All right. I know there's a few more questions, but I think we need to keep moving because I don't want to cut into your time for lunch. So, next up is Bob Snow, who is currently with the Solicitor's Office in the Department of Interior, and he's held in over a quarter century. They held over several different positions at Interior and worked on, I think, every facet of Colorado River management we've talked about so far. You've probably worked on it one time or another, Bob. Today we've asked him to talk about another one of these major parties that is kind of otherwise absent from the discussion of Arizona v. California, and that is Mexico, and specifically about the 319 agreement. So, Bob.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Bob Snow. I work in the solicitor's office, and I got to tell you, it's an honor to be here. I think I know that I'm the person standing between you and lunch.
Well,
and
there's a few others.
a few others, but so I'm gonna be very careful with the time. I want to just describe what's a fascinating chapter in Colorado River history over the past 15 years. It's a little daunting standing up here, though, because peppered throughout the audience are some of the folks that actually negotiated Minute 319 late in the night, some nights early in the morning. So the risk of you're wrong. That's not what it says. No way. That's not what we meant. Those risks are I think that's even more scary to me than a bear at this point. So, but not quite as scary as Eric's question. So I'm gonna work right in that zone. That's gonna be my comfort zone here today. But this discussion about what led to Minute 319 is really just a way of framing 15 years of extraordinary happenings on the U.S.-Mexico border. We've had litigation, we've had negotiation, we've had frustration, we've had presidents involved. I can guarantee you, as a rather low-level staff attorney, just trying to sit at my desk in Washington, knowing that presidents are engaging in private discussions about either a case you're working on or a controversy, it's like the bear breaking in for the whiskey. It can give you an unsettled feeling in your stomach. But we've got a fantastic story, a fantastic facet of the way we're solving problems on the Colorado River in this minute. In law school, I was told, first you tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So, here I'm going to tell you what I'm about to tell you. The story of why Minute 319 worked is the same thing that pervades every other relationship on this river. It's about how to build trust. It's about how to build those personal relationships with folks that at the beginning of a process, you don't understand where they're coming from. You don't understand why they're asking for something. You don't understand why they're furious at a word you just used, because it's fighting words in some context. And until you break through those barriers and you can actually look someone in the eye and find a way to puzzle through what seemed to be an impossible puzzle, you can't solve any of these problems. These are all just issues waiting to be teed up for the Supreme Court and have lawyers who don't work for the federal government get extremely wealthy on many years of litigation. And I have no that's not the way to go. I don't begrudge anyone their earnings, but that's not the way to solve the challenges we have and the bigger challenges that are coming. So, I'm going to say that there's really a couple of three drivers that you can use to describe this period in U.S.-Mexico history on the Colorado River. There's deep and important concerns for the ecosystem in the Colorado River Delta. There were water conservation actions that were taken in the United States that had impacts in Mexico that led to cross-border tensions, litigations, and conflict. And then there's the pervasive looming challenges that we have with climate change, drought, etc. A harbinger of that is the decision announced today where we're going to be reducing flows from Lake Powell. And so we've had litigation, we've had conflict, we've now had negotiation and success and resolution. Overall, from the federal government's perspective, over many administrations, I think there's been the same goal. That is, there's a desire for a good bilateral relationship with Mexico on the border, but that bilateral relationship must work within the structure of the 1944 treaty. couple of images here. This was the signing of the 1944 treaty between the U.S. and Mexico, map of the Colorado River Basin, and some people consider that a beautiful place. That's not why it's up there. The space between the two mesas is the Colorado River Delta, right? It's the evacuated sediment from the Grand Canyon that became one of the most rich and vibrant deltas in the world before the use, diversion, and development of the Colorado River Basin. So just to show that progress can happen, in this map of the Colorado River Basin, we actually continue the basin all the way into the delta. That's, as a federal representative, we can even become more enlightened over time, and our graphics can reflect actual reality. I'm going to just quickly highlight for you all a few of the processes that have evolved under the 1944 treaty, and most of the key elements, not all of them, have been embodied in what are known as minutes, like in the old days, the minutes of a meeting. Minutes are a mechanism established under the 1944 treaty to either resolve a dispute or to add clarification to an area where there's not clear implementation. We've had a series of minutes dating back to calendar year 2000. In calendar year 2000, we had the first agreement between the U.S. and Mexico to look into addressing the environmental needs of the Limit Reach and the Delta. That was known as Minute 306. I'll come back to that. We've had some joint statements, high-level engagement between the two governments, and in recent years, we've had a number of formal minutes adopted under Secretary Salazar, Minute 316, 17, 18, and 19, and I'll go through those for you. So, couple of quick slides. This has been covered adequately in this conference. We're going through a terrible drought, the worst in modern recorded history, one of the worst in 1,200 years. Here's a slide that is an homage to Brad, because I feel the need to make sure I have at least one slide with a font that's impossibly small to read. But basically, this shows the variability of the system over the last 1,200 years. It's a highly variable system, we know that. This is the running average. You've seen this slide also of the declining yield of the system over the last century. And this is the slide that kind of illustrates what Ann Castle was talking about last night. We started this drought brim full. What a blessing that is. We would be in a very different place today if this drought did not start with brimful conditions, and this is what we've lost over the past, the duration of this 14-year drought. So drought is a driver. It's a driver because at some point when reductions are experienced in the United States and portions of the basin are already experiencing reductions, we will have to find a way to deal with the reductions to Mexico under the treaty. That has been long talked about as one of the major meltdown scenarios for U.S.-Mexico relations on the Colorado River. How will the treaty be enforced? Just like how will the decree be enforced? How will benefit? All these different concepts. We found a way to work through them. Minute 319 addresses some of those issues. Here's the Colorado River Delta, a beautiful and now partial ecosystem. You see the Cienega de Santa Clara to the east. That's a picture there. That's from return flows from Arizona. It's an area that has grown up in some ways unexpectedly as a result of some of the salinity concerns that arose back in the 70s. I won't go into great detail. So based on the concerns over the environment in Mexico, based on the concerns over impacts to U.S. listed species found in the environmental areas of the Delta, we had intense, pervasive litigation from about 1996 to 2007. One of the things that litigation does is it occupies a lot of time, a lot of resources. It becomes the main driver when you're a litigant for the United States. That moves to your top priority. So there were three major cases. The first case involved the Lake Mead Delta and in an attempt to protect nesting habitat for the southwestern willow flycatchers in the Southwest Center for Biodiversity litigation. The United States was served with a preliminary injunction that would have forced approximately 5 million acre feet down into the Colorado River Delta. Very interesting case. Ultimately, the United States prevailed, and there was not an injunction entered in that case. There was the pressure of that litigation certainly had a lot to do with the rapid development of the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program, a very important program for the stability of operations in the lower basin. But a piece of the puzzle was, can we force water down to the delta? The direct litigation against environmental concerns in the delta were two cases: Defenders of Wildlife v. Babbitt originally, and then Norton, and then the 2005 case that had to do with the All-American Canal lining. The Defenders of Wildlife case involved the question of, does the United States Bureau of Reclamation have to consult over the impacts of the lack of water in the Colorado River Delta? And a lot of interesting aspects of that litigation, but ultimately what the court held was, no, the Bureau of Reclamation doesn't have unilateral discretion to force water down to the delta. The distribution of water between the two countries is governed by the treaty. The Bureau doesn't have discretion to deviate from the treaty. The Bureau has no duty to consult under the ESA over impacts in Mexico. The most recent and the case with the greatest amount of conflict and political turmoil was the All-American Canal case. Larry McDonald yesterday talked through the history of Arizona v. California, the usage in the basin. This is just a chart showing what California's use was over the prior decades, prior to 2003, when California's use was brought down to its 4.4 limitation. But in a kind of an interesting swirl of like from the mad genius of law school professors, where you have these final exams that are impossible to predict. In this case of the All-American Canal, you had the combination of U.S. domestic NEPA issues, issues regarding NEPA applied across the border, domestic ESA issues, ESA applied across the border in Mexico, all under the rubric of lining a canal to save water, to provide that water to an Indian water rights settlement in California so that California could live within its 4.4 obligation. Every issue that you could possibly want is crammed into the All-American Canal litigation. That's the All-American Canal. It was an unlined canal built authorized under the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and the thought was if we could line a portion of the canal, about roughly 68 or so thousand acre feet could be conserved. However, the water that would be conserved by lining the canal right along the U.S.-Mexican border, see if I can do this without injuring someone, is here's the Colorado River, the canal lining comes right across here. The effect of lining the canal, though, would be to dry up wetlands habitat within the United States, to impact wetlands habitat in Mexico, and also because the groundwater flow is from north to south, northeast to southwest, some of these lands in the northern Mexicali Valley would lose access to water supplies that they've been relying on. They've been relying on that subflow. Well, we lined the canal. This slide shows that. Ultimately, the court cases held for the United States that the water in that case was the United States. The United States could conserve that and transfer that water within California. Ultimately, Congress stepped in while the case was on appeal before the Ninth Circuit and directed that the canal lining proceed. At this point in time, the relations between the U.S. and Mexico over Colorado River issues were at their absolute low. There was a poll taken in the Mexican Congress of the top 3 concerns with the United States, and one had to do with economic development, one had to do with drugs and trafficking and crime, and the third was the All-American Canal. That's not the list you want to be on. It became a matter of personal controversy between President Bush and President Fox. But the courts had spoken, Congress had spoken, the canal lining was due to proceed. There was some creative thinking that went on at about that time to see if there was some way to maybe avoid the lining, and ultimately that didn't play out. But what did happen in 2007 was there was an extraordinary outreach from the Mexican ambassador to the United States to the Secretary of the Interior. At that time it was Secretary Kempthorne. And it was a personal request And the personal request was, this way of doing business does not work. It is not in either nation's interest. It's probably going to lead to a destabilized border. We could have some very significant civil unrest along the border. And we need to find a way to do better. And I just, by chance, happened to be at the conversation where this took place. And it was a very fascinating engagement between the senior leadership from the two countries. Well, Professor Barton talked yesterday a little bit about Thompson talked yesterday a little bit about the different roles of the federal government, and one was timelines and prodding and being a life coach or something. Well, here's an example of the prodding. When that meeting broke up, when there was an expressed desire by the Mexican ambassador to try to do things a little bit better, it's about 10:30 in the morning on a Friday. The Mexican ambassador leaves the secretary's office. The secretary stands up, closes his office doors, turns to the few folks, staffers like myself that were sitting there, and said, all right, it's about 10:30. By 1 o'clock today, I want an outline of how this could work at the State Department. It will be sent by 1 o'clock. All you have to do between now is draft the concepts, work with the lower Colorado region because they serve the water master function, make sure all the assistant secretaries that would be impacted by this have cleared off on it, and make sure it's sitting at the State Department at 1 o'clock. And it was. And that led to a joint statement between the two governments that we would try to do things differently. We'd try to look at the crises ahead and see if we couldn't find a way to sit down at the table, talk, and find solutions together. There wasn't a clue in that room about exactly how we would do it. Pat Mulroy made the point this morning about sort of if you get caught up in the impossibility of what you're doing, you'll never do it. There wasn't a clue in that room. But there was a goal, there was a desire. We can do better, we can try. So that led to initiation of a process under Commissioners Carlos Marin and Arturo Herrera, the United States and Mexican heads of the Joint International Boundary and Water Commission, to start having work groups between the two countries to look at the different areas of concern: environment, water supply, water flexibility, operations. Tragically, they were killed. The two commissioners were killed doing flood inspections on flooding on the Rio Grande. They were out on a joint jointly inspecting flood control damage on the lower Rio Grande, and were tragically killed. But those two men started a process that led to Minute 319. At the very end of the Bush administration in 2009, Secretary Kempthorne once again met with Ambassador Sarikhan, and they kind of memorialized the goal. But Secretary Kempthorne said he wanted a sort of a safe handoff to the next administration. He wanted to make sure that the next administration would pick this issue up, find a way to work with Mexico, and find a way to find some solutions. And he was certain that Senator Salazar was going to be a good partner in making that happen. And the U.S. and Mexican governments memorialized these statements of intent in these releases from 2007 and 2009. Secretary Salazar came on board, and he tasked a young, brilliant lawyer/engineer, so everyone in this room can feel good about him, named Mike Connor, to lead his efforts. And we've had extraordinary progress over the last 4 years. We had 4 minutes adopted in this period of time, and each one built on the prior minute. The first minute involved, Minute 316 involved a demonstration of the Yuma desalting plant, a pilot run for approximately a year at 1/3 capacity. But there was an incredible agreement that was forged between the United States government, the Mexican government, and the NGO community. Each of those three sectors found a way to replace the water that would have been lost to the Cienega, keep the Cienega whole, and then just isolate the test on the performance of the Yuma desalting plant. And somewhere in the room here today was the operator of the plant, so if you have any questions about the Yuma desalting plant, we have one of the world's experts here, Jennifer McCloskey, on that facility. But this goes to another critical point. Brad brought this up earlier, Pat brought this up. Everyone needs to be involved. Well, in minute 316, everyone was involved. The various sectors had a piece, and they had a stake in the outcome. Minute 317 was a process agreement. It was about how are we going to work in these work groups? How are we going to work together to tackle these issues? Well, along comes, so we've got a process agreement under a minute 317. Negotiations are moving along. And then in April of 2010, while folks are sitting at the table, while folks are having sort of ordinary routine meetings without an extraordinary sense of urgency, but a dedication, there's a major 7.2 magnitude earthquake that hits the Mexicali Valley. And the spark goes off. What could we do to respond to help Mexico in light of the circumstance of this earthquake? For those of you in this room that are federal employees, the water that Mexico gets is like use or lose. There's no carryover built into the treaty. They get 1.5 million acre feet a year, that's it. Well, could we do something better? Could we do something different? We did. The concept was discussed as to whether we could allow Mexico to defer a portion of its water that it couldn't use because of the damage, leave that water in U.S. reservoirs, go ahead and implement the repairs that were what needed to be taken, and then, when the repairs were done, when Mexico could use that water, take it back at a later date. Makes a lot of sense. I'll admit it's not expressly found in the exact words of the treaty, but it's in fulfillment of the spirit of the treaty of working together on these resources between the two countries. So, by December of that year, we had an agreement in place. So from between April and December, a lot of hard work went into place. I remember walking into Caesar's Palace for CRUA, the annual association meeting in Las Vegas, and I said to Jennifer Pitt as I was walking through the revolving doors, Minute 319 was probably one of the hardest agreements I'd ever worked on in my career. It was really hard. It was a simple concept, but there were so many legal issues packed into establishing this new opportunity for Mexico that we had to tackle a lot of tricky issues. But we found a way through it. We gave Mexico a 3-year period to undertake its repairs. That water would stay in U.S. reservoirs. That's good for Las Vegas's intake. That's good for endangered species. That's good for hydropower. Benefits all around. We then got to work on a more comprehensive agreement, Minute 319. And we finished that work on Minute 319 last November. According to the Wall Street Journal, the United States remains one of the world's most powerful countries. And one of the powers of the sovereign of the United States is to conduct foreign policy and deal with other countries. As an attorney for the United States government, let me clearly and unequivocally state, Minute 319 could not have happened. This agreement could not be consummated. Like, back to Brad's, for better or for worse, the marriage, this deal could not exist without the NGO community funding flows in Mexico, without water districts in the United States paying, and I'll walk through these elements for you, paying for infrastructure improvements in Mexico, without the agreement of the 7 states. This was a kind of a strange concept for the State Department. You know, I got the luxury of going over to the State Department to say, oh, by the way, yes, you conduct foreign affairs, but not these. There's a whole new thing. You've got to learn about water districts. And part of the reason that people go to work in the State Department is because they don't want to deal with, they deal with nations. They deal with sovereigns. Now they have to deal with Southern Nevada Water Authority. Make what you will of that remark. A powerful entity. We also have to deal with each of the states. We have to deal with the NGOs because they're contributing money to make this deal work. It's a fascinating layered deal, a balanced deal, but a deal that the United States government could not have reached with Mexico on its own. We would have been powerless to consummate this agreement without those players. So Brad talked a little bit earlier about where are the other interests? Are they at the table? Well, they're not at every table, but they're at more tables. And they're making a difference, and part of the difference is in this agreement. It's a very interesting and a balanced agreement. It's got operational agreements, high and low reservoir operations. Mexico will get a little more water when Lake Mead is high, and I appreciate learning from Pat that it will get high again. At some point it will snow. Mexico gets a little bit less water when reservoirs are low. Mexico gets flexibility to defer water over a longer period so that they can take and use water on a more flexible schedule. There's U.S. and federal and non-federal funding that goes into infrastructure improvements in Mexico. A portion of the water saved from those investments in Mexico will come back to the United States, and that's a critical piece to this working. There's going to be canal improvements. There's going to be environmental conservation projects, and there's also an environmental program here where there's a combination of a small pulse or mini flood flow to replenish the Mexican Delta that'll be integrated with base flows that will occur from within the Mexican part of the system to re-water for a period of time the river channel down to the Delta, or at least we're in the process of designing that flow. So there's a lot of key elements to the agreement. We extended the period of time that Mexico could repair its system. As I said, there's these high and low reservoir operational agreements. Mexico can defer water and take it at a later date. The U.S. entities, various entities, make investments in the Mexican infrastructure system. A really important and an interesting little subtlety in the agreement is the U.S. government is actually paying for some infrastructure improvement in Mexico, and that water will just come back and stay in the system. Not assigned to any user, not assigned to any entity, just a small, roughly 30,000 acre feet that will come back and enhance the storage in the system. But when you're dealing with the kind of facility challenges that Southern Nevada Water Authority and Pat mentioned, every foot helps. Lake Mead today is roughly 10 feet higher because of the ICS program and the water that Mexico deferred under Minute 318. That 10 feet is a big deal as we approach these critical elevations. I talked about briefly the environmental flows to the Delta, and an interesting wrinkle where the All-American Canal had been a point of extraordinary controversy between the two countries. There's a study that was authorized under this minute to see if there was a future earthquake because of the hardening of the All-American Canal. Maybe that canal could be used to convey water to Tijuana if they were ever to have a breach of their facilities again. Tijuana lost some of its supply during the 2010 earthquake, and now under this agreement they can at least study routing water through the All-American Canal. We haven't tackled the legal issue as if Mexico does route that water, does it have to be renamed the Mostly American Canal? We will tackle that, though. So, in short, I've got 2 minutes. I'm going to bring it in, just like the Bureau always does, under budget and on time. Who had to agree? Everyone. Any one entity had balked. This agreement couldn't, I don't think it could have been consummated. I don't see how we could have brought it off. We had to consult with the U.S. Senate. We had to work with the NGOs. We had to get the funders. The various boards had to act in time to make sure that the funding agreements would be in place. It takes a village or a basin. Just like we saw sort of a somewhat dour signing of 1944. This was a happier picture of the signing in the Hotel Del on Coronado Island. I would say, I feel like a newbie to this basin. I feel like the new kid on the block, but this was probably the shining day for me. I thought this was an amazing thing to see the two countries come together, NGOs, states, a great achievement. But this isn't my favorite picture. One more thing. We also got a comment. It's nicer to find out that the president's happy about this rather than what is an all-American canal and what it means, what that it's not lined for what. Those kind of details don't work at the presidential level, but consummating a binational agreement between the U.S. and Mexico did seem to go over well. This is my favorite picture. A couple of things. This is the group of negotiators down at the Hotel Lucerna in Tijuana on the day that we wrapped up the final drafting of the agreement. Yes, there's an agreement between nations, but these are the people who gave up time from their families. These are the people who worked weekends. These are the people that ignored their kids. These are the folks, and there's more of them. We lost, some folks had to run for flights. This is the day we wrapped up and at least the negotiators had agreements to present back to their countries that they could recommend. But the dedication on both sides, and there's Mexicans on both sides, there's Americans, it's not us versus them. One of the things we learned was how to work as a team between the two countries, and we pulled it off. The other thing last thought, you don't have to flash, I'll keep this to 30 seconds, is minute 319 sort of felt like if there was a branding exercise, it's minute 319 brought to you by the University of Colorado. Because the key players came from here. I mean, as a young attorney, I got to work on drafting minute 306 under Secretary Babbitt. And who was I asked to consult with on the language? David Getches. I mean, what a way to start your career. At any point in the negotiations, the most well-represented institution was CU. You had the modelers were all from here. You had Karen Kwan, John Ensminger, Mike Connor, Terry Fulp. It was like a gang. It was like an alumni association there. So my hat's off to this institution because you have produced some open-minded folks that know how to work hard and solve problems, and it was my honor to get to work with those CU folks, and or University of, I don't know the exact acronym. Is it CU okay?
Yeah.
So that's an overview of 319. I think I'm about a minute over. Thanks for paying attention, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks, Bob. We are not quite on time and under budget, so I'm going to not open it up for questions for you, Bob. I'm going to get to our respondents, and then I hope that if there is some questions there, then that if someone has a question they really want to ask you, they'll do it then. Okay. We have two respondents. I think your program still lists 3. Bob Johnson was going to also join our respondent panel, but he got called away today, but that probably helps with our schedule a little bit. Our 2 respondents are Jennifer Pitt and Herb Becker. Jennifer Pitt, again, most of you know these people, it's with Environmental Defense Fund, where she's the organization's lead person on Colorado River Matters, and has done a lot of work at the end of the system, even though she lives in Boulder, on the Delta, so I'm sure she'll have interesting things to say about 319, and as well as things to say about some of the water banking ideas that were presented earlier, because I know you're busy working on those. We'll also hear from Herb Becker, who's been working on Indian water rights issues for, I would guess, over 40 years, primarily in New Mexico and also Arizona and probably a few other places around. And I can't give a detailed introduction of Herb because I've never met him before, but I've heard his name again and again and again, and I thought, the only way I'm going to meet this man is if I invite him to come to a conference. And you remember my horoscope. I'm feeling unusually powerful, so I made it happen. Okay. So I don't think it matters which order we go in. Jennifer, do you want to kick it off? Okay.
Thank you very much for having me here. I've actually not been able to attend the CU Summer Conference at the Natural Resource Law Center for a few years. So thank you for moving it to August. It's easier on my schedule. So I am actually going to try to make some comments, as Doug indicated, that include some of the presentations we heard before the break, the banking, as well as Bob's presentation on 319, and maybe even touching on Julia's excellent presentation on marketing tribal water rights. I do, however, want to start out with to add a little bit to Bob's story about how all this business with Mexico really got started, to say that in the summer of 2007, before his 1 p.m. memo was due, there was a team of us working with the NGOs, both in the United States and Mexico, who thought that in the wake of the construction of the Drop 2 Canal, which conserves system water in the United States, basically at the expense of excess flows running down the system, i.e. flows to the Colorado River Delta, that it was time to start a conversation about US and Mexico management of the Colorado River across the border. And so I called up some of my colleagues at some of the state and municipal or wholesale water supply agencies, and I called my colleagues in Mexico and had them bring together some water managers from Mexico, and I got my US colleagues to meet me at the border, and I took them down into Tijuana, and Van met us at the McDonald's and right on the Mexican side of the Tijuana border, and we went down and had a couple of meetings actually over that summer where we began to talk about what could change in the US and Mexican relationship over the Colorado River if we were looking for ways to make management better and easier. There was nothing conclusive, but I like to think that that might have paved the way for a little bit for Bob's 1 p.m. memo, at least maybe in getting some of the lower basin sign-off that you needed in that quick turnaround time. So I think it's been well demonstrated or well discussed in these last couple of days, and now formalized in Reclamation's announcement, that the status quo in Colorado River management cannot hold. We're looking at declining reservoir elevations. We're peering into the abyss of shortages, which maybe don't have dire consequences in the near term, but certainly persisting over the long term could have very dire consequences. So we're looking for new ways to do business, and I think that we've heard this morning about some new ways of doing business that offer hope for other kinds of agreements we may have going forward. So specifically, I want to call out Minute 319, as well as some of the lower basin interstate banking and water sharing agreements that really both focus on the use of flexibility and sharing rather than apportioning pieces, a piece of water for one user and a piece of water for another user. These agreements focus more on how we share water in times of surplus and how we share shortages in times of drought. And that kind of flexibility going forward, applied more broadly in the basin, I think offers the most promise. A couple of comments specifically on banking, and Eric touched on some of these issues in one of his slides. But first of all, the key is not to impose shortages on water users that can't tolerate them. We want to use markets to incentivize willing sellers to cut back water use where it can be withstood. That's the basic premise of water marketing, and we tried this out as a proposal in the NEPA document, the NEPA analysis for the 2007 interim surplus or interim management guidelines. which we called conservation before shortage. And I know that that name is now forever cursed because the NGOs put it out there, but I think the basic concept still applies, which is that if we can implement water conservation, we may not have to live with those shortages. A couple of caveats, though, about banking, and that is, one, that we have to be able to manage the markets to make sure that those transfers work for agricultural water users and rural communities. There can be impacts to systems if it's not managed well. Specifically, there's shared irrigation infrastructure that needs to be maintained, and if we can't assure that those systems can be maintained, then having one, harming other water users other agricultural water users who haven't bought into a forbearance agreement is not going to work. There are also communities, rural communities, where agriculture is a substantial base of the economy that can be harmed if we are not careful in how we structure these markets, because the sudden loss of jobs and the sudden loss of tax revenues at the local and local government level can be significant. And so if we're going to stand up these kind of banking arrangements, we're going to have to be attending those interests to make them work, or the agricultural community will not come along with us in this. The other caveat is that we have to manage these markets to certainly to protect our environmental resources and hopefully even to restore them. Ann Castle said it best yesterday. Environmental and recreational flows are not just nice things. They are essential to our economies across the Southwest. And boy, it's great to hear someone at Interior saying that. We've been thinking it for a long time, at least I'm paid to think that, working for Environmental Defense Fund. I'd like to see us figure out how to set up these markets in ways that avoid harm to rivers, and possibly even in ways that allow us to implement restoration. One concept that we've been looking at and starting to talk about in some basin-wide contexts is that while there are some parts of this basin where we already have seriously impaired rivers, and we have the endangered species, unfortunately, to prove it, there are also some places where we have pretty good river conditions and pretty good species representation, and maybe our strategy should be to ensure protections for those places. There's no federal law that tells us to do that. That's not what the Endangered Species Act is about. However, if we're using markets and we have an opportunity to guide them to get us the outcome that we want, we might be able to ensure protection of some of those sort of species refugia, if you will, places that are still in good shape, as a way to ensure the ecological resilience that we want to see in the future in this basin, particularly as the basin continues to change in ways that we actually can't fully anticipate as the climate continues to warm. So those were really the main points I wanted to make. The last is to say that what Bob took you through in terms of the history and the construction of Minute 319 is, to me, one of the most hopeful signs in this basin that dealing with the environment in a multi-party agreement that also addresses the needs of water users is possible. And I'll just give you, I'm part of the team that's working on implementation of Minute 319 in terms of preparing for that pulse flow for the Delta, the environmental pulse flow and the base flows. And I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a preview of where we're at. We're in the middle of planning, so there's not a lot of detail to share, but we've brought together a team of policy people and scientific experts, totaling about 35 or 40 people. We actually met Monday and Tuesday this week in Tijuana for the second big convening of this group, and we are trying to review what we know about the Delta ecosystem, which is not a ton. It's a changing system, and moreover has not been super well studied. There hasn't been a ton of money gone into studying that system, but we're trying to look at how best to deliver the water to that system under the provisions of Minute 319. And what we do know is that Reclamation has been very keen on making sure that that delivery of the pulse flow occurs in 2014, because it's going to be harder to do it the closer the reservoirs get to a declared shortage. So we are going full guns ahead to try to be ready for a pulse flow release next spring. It's an experiment. There has never been a purposeful release of water into the Colorado River Delta. We're working with a bucket of water that is not anybody's ideal environmental release, but it's what we have, and we're going to do the best we can with it and try to learn a lot about how this ecosystem responds to water, as well as to ensure that we're creating some good habitat and that we are getting some good bang for the buck in terms of the resources invested for this pulse flow. The base flow is going to be provided over the term of Minute 319, which is through 2017, and it's being provided by an entity called the Colorado River Delta Water Trust, which has been established for a few years now. It's an entity that exists within Mexico, and it purchases water on the open market in the Mexicali Valley, only Mexican water rights, and it can then, working with the agencies in Mexico, it sets up delivery of that water to habitat areas in the Colorado River Delta. So particularly, I think the long-term goal for this trust is to be able to have a base flow that is what you typically think of as a base flow flowing through the channel of the river. But because we're working with a very small percentage of what you might actually need for a sustainable base flow, and we have to extend it over these next few years, it's likely water that is going to be delivered to irrigate both actively created habitat areas, as well as to ensure that we're continuing to provide water to any habitat that is generated through this pulse release, which is expected to help us create new habitat. We want to ensure that there's water available to sustain those areas. So that's what we're working on. It's, I have to say, a delight in my career, which has been basically more than a decade of trying to convince people that delivering some water to the Colorado River Delta is a valuable exercise, and mostly getting in arguments about that. I'm now sitting around a table with federal agencies, state agencies from both the United States and Mexico, and we're all working together to get good results out of this experiment, and it is incredibly gratifying. So my hope is that as we move forward, changing management, because we know the status quo can't hold, that we can find the ways to build into our new agreements opportunities to both protect and restore rivers throughout the basin, to align our interests, and so that we leave future generations the Colorado River Basin that we know and love. Thanks.
It is now afternoon, and ever mindful of Doug being all-powerful, I will stay within my time. It is good to be here. As Doug mentioned, I've been doing this stuff for over 40 years, and I was heartened to see my good friend and classmate, John Eckerhawk, come in the room too, to remind me that there are other people like me out here. Coincidentally, I represent Jicarilla and Mescalero Apache tribes, and also work with the 10-tribe partnership of which Crit is here. So I can respond to Julie's comments that she had up here on the board. One of the fascinating things of the Jicarilla settlement is that, I'm going to use the hated word here, marketing is permitted by Congress for Jicarilla water rights. Congress, in authorizing Jicarilla to market their water rights did something kind of unique. It allows the tribe to export out of the Colorado River Basin 6,500 acre feet depletion and market that in the Rio Grande Basin. We pursue marketing rather aggressively. We've had like an eBay auction to see how that works. For that process, the revenues each year, as you would imagine with the drought coming on, have increased, much to the happiness of the tribe. And there was a question earlier to Julie about, as tribes' rights are quantified, what will that do in the marketing thing? To date, no tribe that has a quantified water right has been authorized to market that water. The Mescalero provision, which Julie talked about, was the first attempt by a tribe to have congressional legislation passed authorizing it to market its decreed rights. We worked, and we're rather fortunate, and worked rather closely to Tanya Trujillo back here on the Senate staff in getting legislation drafted, introduced, had hearings. The House, in the end, unanimously approved it. It went over to the Senate, and the hearings there were favorable. But in the end, one of the senators, for who we subsequently come to find out, opposes tribes' ability to market their decreed rights, was able to kill the bill. He has since retired, and so we have now reintroduced the legislation to see what this Congress will do. We thought it was a slam dunk with the Republican House passing it. The bill had some features. We agreed that the marketing would only be in New Mexico, that there would be no responsibility on the United States' part. The tribe had sole ability to approve the lease or not. And if we screwed up, there was no liability against the United States because we had a hold harmless clause in there. And because we kept the United States out, there was no expenditure of federal funds. So we thought, what better for this Congress to put that act, but as I say, it died in the end, so we're hoping it goes forward. Our work with the 10 tribes, the Colorado River Basin Tribes Partnership, on the study that was talked about yesterday and today, we've asked the Bureau of Reclamation to continue work, and they've agreed to have a separate study just dealing with Indian water rights. We've been meeting with Larry Okoviak, who's the director of Bureau Rec Upper Basin, and Terry Fulp, director of Bureau Rec Lower Basin, and their technical teams developing a scope of work to address issues that we feel are really important to the tribe. One of the major ones is, as you know, yesterday there was a talk of 2.9 million acre feet settlement and decreed rights that the tribe have. Of that 2.9, 2.3 million is in the upper basin. That will increase as we go along, and the rest of the tribes have their rights decreed. In the meantime, non-Indian communities have come to rely on this unused water that the tribes have rights to. As the tribes develop on the reservation and bring that water on the reservation, these communities are going to have to somehow figure out how to replace that or work closely with the tribes and maybe a voluntary water transfer or marketing to let them continue to use that. So we've asked the Bureau in their model development to quantify the extent of these rights and where those pinch points are in the system so that we can start working with the states and the communities that are relying on this water. Marketing, as I said, is a hated word to some people, but it is a way for tribes to utilize their resource, have economic development, and provide water to communities that need it, which would otherwise not be available. In this study that the Bureau is taking in conjunction with the tribes, we've asked that the Bureau establish a formal process of setting up coordination with the tribes and the state so that meetings from now on dealing with water issues within the basin, there will be a table, at the table will be the DOR, the basin states, and the tribes. We've seen, the projections of water being about 13.2 million. Tribes at this stage with 2.9 million acre feet. That's a huge chunk of water that they have. And states really have to figure out a way of dealing with the tribes because, as we know, their authority, state's authority, ends at the reservation boundaries, and the states are free, the tribes are free to put that water to any use they want. So we've asked for that. With that, I'm at my time, and the all-powerful man is standing up, so I will sit down. Thank you.
To clarify, unusually powerful, I believe, is the idea. It's an important distinction. Along those lines, we are actually over our time by a minute or two, but I promised you guys a chance to ask questions, and I specifically said if you had a question for Bob, this would be the time to do it. I know people are always hesitant to ask questions when you're what's standing between lunch, but questions?
Good.
Yeah, you can ask one.
Yes. And this kind of, it goes to the 319 environmental flows component and what your experience may have provided, where you said you had that there was a base flow for the delta that many folks believe would be ideal, almost magical water. What is that base flow, do you think? Have you heard, has that been discussed?
So there's some literature that discusses an estimate of both a base flow and a pulse flow for the delta. The system actually needs both. It needs a pulse flow to create overbank flooding to regenerate the habitat. Trees don't live forever. And it needs a base flow to keep everything alive because everything depends on water to stay alive. There's never been experiments in this system, and it's a vastly changed ecosystem from what the delta was 100 years ago before we had developed water use in the West. So there were some estimates that were made based on a flow that occurred when the Gila flooded in 1997. And it was a pretty small flow, but they looked and said, well, this pulse flow actually flooded within the levees. It's a tiny little system compared to what that delta used to be. So there are estimates based on that past. They are not the same numbers that we have in the minute. These numbers were negotiated in terms of what was possible, not based on an ecological need. But I don't know that those ecological estimates are all that useful. First of all, they're estimates from the past. The system has even changed since then. So we don't know, but we hope that what we're doing in the next few years is stood up not just as a way to create habitat, but as an experiment from which we learn. And I could better answer your question next time around.
Okay. We have time, I think, for one more, if there is one more. Do I see one more? I don't see one more. It's my observation from the 319 process. It sounds like Bob got a presidential proclamation and you got a Happy Meal at the Tijuana McDonald's. You packed your own lunch. Okay.
But,
Speaking of lunch, well,
but Jennifer lives in Boulder.
yeah. Well, all right. Well, let's thank our presenters. All right. We are now at lunch.